videos. I just want to double check that I have it set up properly here. Whoops, not what I want. Let's just come back in here again. That's clicking too fast. There we go. Fantastic. So you should be able to see my desktop at this particular point. Yep. Nope.
Yes,
Possibly.
I can.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to play a few videos. Now, keep in mind, these videos are actually rather intriguing because they deal with the psychological profile of how we determine what are the characteristics and conditions of an employee's lifestyle and how they actually interact with the workplace. So as you watch these, keep in mind that there will be some documentation that's required a little bit later. And we're going to start off by going into some of the information about the Taylor experience. So it'll give you a better idea as to how this plays out. So let's take a look at Taylor, and it'll give us an indication of some of the variables involved. Oops, wrong side. Hold on.
It's about productivity. All sorts of businesses are finding all sorts of ways to make their workplace more efficient. And so finding tonight the century on Friday. It's about productivity. All sorts of businesses are finding all sorts of ways
So
to make
before
their
I go any
workplace more efficient.
further, can you hear that? Oh, they took off.
No, no, I could hear it.
Okay, so that means everybody should be able to hear it.
Finding tonight the century on Friday. It's about productivity. All sorts of businesses are finding all sorts of ways to make their workplace more efficient. And so tonight, what many people believe is the most important ism of the 20th century, as in Taylorism. It is sometimes argued that Taylorism has made the most lasting contribution to American thought since the Federalist Papers. Taylorism, you might ask? Chances are you live and work by it. Tonight, the extraordinary impact of Frederick Winslow Taylor. At the turn of the century, when the Industrial Revolution hit its stride and was beginning to change everything, Frederick Winslow Taylor became convinced that one machine could turn America into an economic powerhouse, the stopwatch.
Frederick Taylor was the first efficiency expert. He came into the factories of the industrial Northeast and changed them.
Machines had already changed the mills of the 19th century, but the workers who ran them clung to the old ways of doing things. Trades were learned literally from watching another laborer. Workers were paid for piecework and were loath to work any faster, lest bosses lower the rate. Frederick Taylor thought the system was ridiculously inefficient.
He was the first person to come along and say, we can treat work as a science just as we can anything else. We can analyze it, we can tear it apart, and we can reconstruct it in a new, more efficient way.
Taylor was born into Philadelphia's Quaker aristocracy. He was born rich. His father never worked a day in his life. Taylor was accepted by Harvard, but he did not go. Instead, he learned about factories, how to read mechanical drawings, how to be a machinist. He became a consultant for America's steel industry when he convinced the mill owners that he could speed up production. They worked, and Taylor watched. And he timed. He timed everything. Every job was broken up into tasks, each task timed with an eye to efficiency. Taylor determined that coal shovelers were most efficient lifting exactly 21.5 pounds. And he designed the perfect, most efficient shovel and a schedule of how many lifts each worker should do every minute, every hour, when they should rest. Productivity soared. The workers hated it.
He deprived workers of control over the workplace, over their tools, and over their use of their bodies.
Taylor couldn't understand the animosity. He thought surely that more productivity would lead to happier workers who were better paid. By 1911, when he published his Principles of Scientific Management, the enthusiasm for Taylor's ideas had grown. In its division of labor and insistence upon speed, Henry Ford's assembly line followed Taylor's principles. Before long, Taylorism was felt everywhere. How to type faster, how to perform surgery faster. By the 1930s, Taylor's ideas of efficiency were even making themselves felt in the family kitchen.
An efficiently planned kitchen frees the housewife from fatigue.
But organized labor was never happy with Taylor. Even Hollywood was wondering where it might all lead. Taylor's one best way of doing things, organized efficiency, became central to the conduct of business in the 20th century. You can see it today on the assembly lines which produce our cars, our computers, our cheeseburgers, even our coffee.
New gurus have appeared in the managerial field, but none of them has had the influence of Frederick W. Taylor.
That would have pleased Taylor. He never knew the full extent of his influence. He became ill and died in 1915 at the age of 59. It is said that the last thing he did before he died was wind his watch. Taylorism, unionism, consumerism, it's all on our website, thecentury.com. That's our report on World News Tonight. Don't forget 2020 later and Nightline. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good weekend and good night.
Fantastic. So one of the fascinating areas within Taylorism is that it pretty well defined how people should actually perform within an office environment. And for the manager, this is a very important element, how to utilize those resources to the maximum extent. And remember, I've said this many times now, to get the best possible return for the organization. So we have a couple more to watch. The next one I want to watch is about bureaucracy. So we're going to take a look at the characteristics of bureaucracy. It's a great way of setting up this chapter because the chapter deals specifically with these topics. So let's take a look at this one.
Sociologist Max Weber studied the structure of organizations and theorized that there were 5 main characteristics of an ideal bureaucracy. So no matter what the goal of a specific organization is, whether it is a business or a religious organization or a charity, it would display these 5 basic features. The first is the division of labor. So within a bureaucracy, people are trained to do specific tasks. So the person who works in the administration office at your university probably doesn't teach classes, and professors aren't usually responsible for building maintenance. And there are some really good aspects of this. When people specialize, they can really become experts in the areas that they're working in. And it can help to increase the overall efficiency of the organization, especially large-scale organizations. But it can also have some downsides as well. According to conflict theory, this type of division of labor can increase feelings of alienation in individual workers because it separates them from other workers and denies them the pride associated with seeing a task through from beginning to end, which might also lead to less worker satisfaction and less productivity overall. It can also lead to what's referred to as trained incapacity within the general organization, or cases where workers become so specialized in their tasks that they lose touch with the overall picture. The next characteristic of bureaucracy is a hierarchy of organization. Rather than all members of a bureaucracy being equal, each position is under the supervision of a higher authority. And this can be positive in that it can help to clarify who is in command. It can tell us who is in charge of what. But it can also deprive individuals of having a voice in decision-making, especially those who are lower down on the hierarchical chain. This structure can also allow people to shirk responsibility, and this is especially troublesome when it comes to unethical tasks. You may have heard of the term, "I was just following orders." This structure can also allow individuals to hide mistakes, sometimes serious mistakes, since no one person interacts with all members. The third characteristic of bureaucracies is the existence of written rules and regulations. And as you might expect, rules and regulations do a lot of good for an organization. They let workers know what is expected of them, They help to ensure uniform performance by all members or workers. They can help to maintain equal treatment of all employees. And they can give a sense of unity or continuity to an organization. Because even if individual members come and go, the laws and structure of the organization can remain the same. But as with all of the other things we have mentioned, there can be a dark side to this as well. Because rules can sometimes stifle creativity from individual members. And if an organization has too many rules, if it has too much structure, it may discourage employees from taking initiative. It can also lead to goal displacement, or cases where commitment to following the rules becomes more important than the original goals of the organization. The fourth characteristic is impersonality. And I know that this might sound like it's a completely negative term, but here it's being used in an interesting way. It is used to describe how individuals and officials are supposed to conduct their activities in an unbiased manner. So it's supposed to ensure equal treatment of each person within an organization. But of course, impersonality can also lead to feelings of alienation, because it can lead to the perception that those in charge are cold and uncaring. And it can even serve to discourage loyalty to the group. The last characteristic is longer than the other ones. It is employment based on technical qualifications. And I actually kind of see this one as being an offshoot of impersonality, because this describes how hiring within a bureaucracy is supposed to be based on the qualifications that a person has and should not be influenced by either favoritism or personal rivalries. And this can be really positive. Obviously, it can serve to decrease discrimination based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. However, in some ways it can also serve to decrease ambition, because it might lead people to do only what is necessary to secure a job or promotion and nothing more. It can also lead to what is known as the Peter Principle, which was put forth by a man named Lawrence J. Peter. And this is the idea that every employee within a hierarchy will keep getting promoted until they reach a level of incompetence. So talented people get promotion after promotion until finally they advance to a position that they can't handle. And so they remain at that position because they aren't good enough at that current job to get promoted any further.
Fantastic. So these are just a couple of elements that we take into consideration. Bureaucracy, in a sense, with the Weber philosophy. We also took a look at the Taylorism philosophy. There is one more, but we'll look at this a little bit later as we start into some of these slides. So let me just open up the slides here for a moment. Just going to do one quick little thing here. Any questions so far about what we just watched? Anyone? Someone? No one? Nobody home?
No questions. No questions.
No questions? Okay. Fantastic. So the one thing I want you to keep in mind as we begin into this chapter is that when it comes right down to it, and when we're really trying to explore the idea of management, you have finite resources available to you, and you must be able to get them to accomplish a significant amount. When you think of hiring somebody at $30 or $20 an hour, whatever it happens to be, or even $14 an hour, you have to get that much and then a little bit more than that back again. So whatever they're doing, you really do have to have a return. And the return has to be adequate enough to, let's say, to make sense out of the deployment of that individual or those equipments or whatever it is that you're implementing to get something in return. You have to make sure that it's adequate. And that means you have to understand the resource. So it's easy enough to understand a machine. We just read a manual and we get a better idea about it. But when it comes to human beings, of course, there are ways of increasing productivity, and there are ways of strategically decelerating what an individual can accomplish as well. So the Hawthorne philosophy of breaking things down a little bit literally speeded up the process, where they showed you Henry Ford there with the automobile. It used to be that 1 to 2, even 3 people would work on a car, but usually it was only 1 or 2 people would work on a car, and they would build it from scratch. This meant they had to know everything about that automobile and be able to assemble it. However, we're using the Taylor philosophy. It became really easy to break it down so that each person did just one thing. And that kind of made it a little upsetting because, number one, you can't control your job anymore. Now it's just a question of repetitive, doing the same thing over and over again. Of course, with adding the Weber philosophy and this concept of hierarchical structure, it kind of made it very difficult for people to see themselves as how they fit into an organization. Before, when a person could build from scratch something and then complete it, they could see how they fit in and how important they were. And everybody wants to recognize that they have some practical value in society. So here's a situation where now you do only one thing. For instance, I gave you the example of McDonald's, where the person puts on a pickle, and that's all they do is put on pickles. And then you have another person who just puts on ketchup, and somebody puts mustard. No one person does multiple functions. They do a single function. And that means you can speed up the process astronomically. But if a person's doing just one hamburger at a time, it takes time to do all of the different things. They have to shift their body in order to grab a container. And it doesn't seem like much, but when you add up the seconds become hours, the hours become days, and the days become weeks. When you look at the final analysis at the end of the year, you've lost a tremendous amount of time and money. So being able to split things down, or division of labor in a sense, it actually does speed up the entire process. But that means the manager must understand the philosophy, because remember, they're the ones who are defining the work. They're defining the task, and they must be able to do so, let's say, prodigiously and also profitably. So we're just going to go through some of these slides, and then we'll take a look at another video a little bit later. So we want to know a few questions, and we want to be able to answer those questions. The first one is, what can be learned from classical managerial thinking? Well, we're actually looking at the Taylor philosophy. We're looking at some of the other ones, bureaucracy, Weber. We're also looking at the Hawthorne, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. And there's a few others that go along with it. Each one of them have very specific ways of evaluating performance and being able to take a fundamental job and break it down into steps. The one thing that I've learned throughout my life is that when you take a difficult situation and you break it down into simple little steps, it becomes elementary, very simplistic to do. And we also want to know what insights come from the behavioral management approach. So we definitely need to be able to construct some kind of awareness or understanding as to how the resources within the company are implemented and what we're going to get back for them. So we need to be able to understand them. And this is where the behavioral management comes into it. We also want to understand the foundations of modern business thinking, especially when it's managerial. How do we actually implement our strategies at this particular point? And you and I have already discovered there are only 4 major categories, planning being one of the most important ones. And of course, we have all the other 3 as well, up all the way to the evaluation or control. So let's take a look at this first question. So what can be learned from older styles of management, classical forms? And when we're looking at this, there's a lot of little things that took place. There's scientific management, again, the Taylor philosophy of evaluate, watch, analyze, break it down a little bit. Of course, it upsets people, but it upsets people because now they do the same thing repetitively over and over and over, and they lose control of their own task. The other thing that happens, which is really important, and we won't even come back to this until much later in the course, but one of the things that happens is an individual loses sight to what they are accomplishing. When an individual cannot see how they fit in, they become very disgruntled because they can't see how their position is significant. And therefore, fear jumps into this equation. So we definitely need to incorporate some kind of, let's say, morality or moral or coaching, and we can add a lot of different variables in here. But we have to make sure that that individual can perceive themselves as being significant within the organization. So the scientific management is an older approach. It's part of the classical. And also administrative principles that were definable, how we actually monitor, manage, and take care of the people within our organization. And of course, the hierarchy levels, the bureaucracy. In other words, everything is almost duplicated in a sense. We'll take a look at these. So classical approaches, once again, the Frederick Taylor model. Remember these because they will definitely be in your final exam. So Frederick Taylor, the scientific management principles of work, and also the administrative principles of Henry Feuer. So Henry Feuer, we're going to take a look at his work as well shortly. And also the bureaucratic model, which was Max Weber. Each of these is the old way of doing things, and yet much of it has carried on into today's society as well. The scientific management of Frederick Taylor, once again, it's really a question of setting ground rules for motion. So developing rules of motion, standardized work, implementing, and also proper working conditions for every job. The tools should be close at hand. The person should not have to go walking anywhere to find something. And any kind of activity should be the same repetitively over and over and over again. So this is the implementing of standardization. Everything should be exactly the same each time it is applied. Careful selection of workers. Once again, you need the right people for the right job. And of course, this is carried on even today. We want to make sure that we have the right resource. This is the individual who is capable of doing that particular function. Carefully training the workers, ensuring that they are given incentives in order to learn the new material. But once again, we're really not trying to create let's say, a generality of knowledge. We're trying to create a specific knowledge. So as you notice there with people kind of banging away with hammers, that's all they have to do. So they have to be good enough to be able to use a hammer for hours and hours and hours. You don't want to have a person who would only be able to hit the nail 10 times and would have to take a break for 30 minutes. You want the person who can hit that nail for maybe an entire 6 or 7 hours straight. So you're looking for specific characteristics. Support workers, once again, carefully planning their work, making sure that any obstacle to their ability to do what they need to accomplish is taken out of the way. So tools very close so that they only have to reach for it. They don't have to actually walk somewhere. One of the things, I'll give you an idea of why this is actually important. I remember taking my car in to have, I think it was, they were changing the spark plugs. And it was at Canada Tire, which I never go to anymore because they charge you by the hour. And they don't do very much during that hour. I was just watching them through the glass because they have a big glass that lets you watch the guys in the shop. And the guy would walk over, look at the car. He would then walk back to his desk, and then he'd walk back to the car. And I'm wondering, why are you doing this? Why don't you just take your tools with you? Some of the other guys had them on rollers where they could actually roll their stuff around. But this guy wanted to do one thing at a time. And I'm thinking, they're charging me 60 some dollars an hour plus parts and labor. And I'm really beginning to get a little upset here. This is why it's really important to have your tools close. And any parts that they would need, well, you don't have to they have to walk out. They have to go up to a desk and ask for the parts to be pulled off the shelf. I can understand that, but this is something that could be done a better way. Maybe just simply typing into a computer that they need these parts and then have the parts brought out to them. This way it would cut down the cost rather dramatically. But of course, that's not the way they want to do it. So with the Frederick Taylor approach, it really is a strategic approach to reduce by dividing the task down a little bit and then making sure that the resources and the training and anything else is necessary is actually there implemented at that particular moment. The scientific management is an extension of this, and this is the Gilbreth approach, is motion study science of reducing a job or task to its basic physical motions. This is carrying it even a step further so that repetitiveness is eliminated. Remember, the idea is if I can do things as quickly as possible, but still get them done exactly the same way they would normally be done, but just by cutting, let's say, erroneous or extraneous activities out of the equation, then I can speed up production and I can do more tasks within the same amount of time. And eliminating wasted motions and improving performance. This definitely does. If an individual doesn't have to turn and just can keep working on what they're doing, it really does speed up the task a great deal. Practical lessons from this managerial philosophy of science. Making results-based compensation a performance incentive. The more you do, the more you get. This is something that is often used in, let's say, business offices sometimes, but mainly on receiving docks or any kind of manufacturing cells that may actually exist in a company. The more you're able to accomplish, the higher your incentives will be. And carefully designing the job with efficient work methods. And again, we're trying to cut down the steps involved, but we're still trying to do the same task. And it is possible. It's just a question of analyzing very carefully and carefully selecting the workers and their abilities to do those particular jobs. You often find people who are highly challenged by some of the simplest things that need to be done, and yet other people intuitively pick up on it. So you're basically looking for people who pick up on things in a very specific way. Training the workers to perform the job to the best of their abilities. Again, you really do have to understand how it needs to be done. I do know that McDonald's and sometimes some of the other fast food places, I know that Domino's does this quite frequently. They actually have championships of who can spin the fastest pizza or make the fastest pizza. Again, based on whatever criteria they give you, your ability to produce a pizza, throw it in the oven, and yet have it exactly the same quality as if you took your time. And this way they can measure what is the true cost of making that particular pizza. And when you think about it, when you look at a pizza at $6 or $7, I bought a pizza last night, which was $38, but then that 50% coupon was only half the price. It was really great. And I usually, when I get a pizza, especially with the 50% coupon, I load it with everything I can put on it. Becomes a meal for a month. And of course, we train the supervisors as well, and anyone who has to support those individuals, so they know exactly what to do and how to do it. Again, we're trying to make sure that whatever we implement, these are our personal resources in the department, and we want to make sure that they work extremely efficiently and effectively. So the more you put into it, the better it's going to be as a result. With Henry Foyer, in this case here, we have 14 principles. These are the administrative principles, and most of these are carried on today as well. Division of labor is one of the most important elements out there. Divide and conquer, we could call it as well. Authority, having a very specific representative for the employee. In other words, having a supervisor, not 20 or 30 of them, but one that they can report to. So they know that authority. We're going to explore each of these. We also want to make sure there's a disciplinary system. We've discovered that in the last course. Unity of command, unity of direction, subordination of individual interests, remuneration, what will we give them, centralization of authority, scalar chain, the line of chain, in other words, the line of authority, and order, equity, personal tenure, initiative, and also esprit de corps. And we'll take a look at each one of these. So these fundamentals are broken down into 5 fundamental rules. These are the duties of management. Foresight, to complete a plan of action for the future. As I've mentioned many times, planning when it comes to management is an absolute requirement. You must plan ahead. You can't wait till something takes place in order to try to figure it out. Remember, I've mentioned this several times now, most managers have very little free time to do anything. They're always constantly working at something. So foresight, preparing in advance for what you need to accomplish, this becomes very important in how you'll deal with things. Organization, to provide and mobilize the resources that you intend to implement to get your plan functioning properly. In other words, we want that plan to work, so we have to take what resources we have, our scarce resources, and we need to implement them in such a way that it gives us, once again, a chance of successfully completing our plan, or at least living up to our expectations within the plan. The command to lead, select, and also to evaluate workers to get the best possible reward or results towards that particular plan. We need the resources to work properly. We need to match our goals, reach our goals, even exceed our goals. So we're constantly trying to move towards the best possible outcome for that particular plan. And coordination. We're really trying to get a good fit of diverse efforts towards, and also ensuring information is shared and problems are solved. We don't want to leave anything for the potential of coming back at us. We want to make sure it's solved. So if there's an issue, we want to communicate that information and get the best possible return again. And of course, the control factor, once again, to make sure that things happen according to the plan. We can actually take some kind of reactive activity, such as, let's say, corrective activity when something goes wrong. So control becomes the evaluation or analysis, and therefore also the implementation of making corrective action as we go along. So once again, foresight, organization, command, coordination, and control. And these are considered to be the 5 rules for duties of management. So some of those key principles, well, these are things that we really do want to be cognizant of. As I said, division of labor is a big one, but we also have scalar chain. There should only be one individual that you are communicating with, one supervisor only. So there should be a clear and unbroken line of communications from the top of the organization all the way down to the bottom. So scalar chain, think of it as a consistent connection to the next level, all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom. And it should be clearly defined so that there is no misinterpretation. Unity of command, each person should receive orders from only one significant manager or one boss or one supervisor. You shouldn't have to worry about 2 or 3 people telling you what to do. It should only be one person. It eliminates confusion. And yet in history, it oftentimes was you may have 2 or 3 supervisors or 2 or 3 foremen, and they would be telling you what to do. And it's not always they tell you the same thing, because let's keep in mind, they all want to look good. So your efforts are going to make them look good. So they're going to choose the things that make them look good, not necessarily you or the other boss. Unity of direction. One person should be charge of all activities with the same performance objectives. Again, we don't want a supervisor who controls too many different genres. We want an individual who is focused in one specific area. This makes it easier to control the resource, and it also makes it easier to instruct those resources and train them and coach them. Now, there is another concept here. We talked about the bureaucracy, which is Max Weber's philosophy. And again, we're talking about historical management. So bureaucracy, in many ways, it's not a bad philosophy because it does create order. And that's one of its fundamental aspects. It's an ideal, intentionally rational, and very efficient form of organization. Its philosophy is to break things down to be highly specific, based on the principles of logic, order, and also legitimate authority. And again, every particular level is very specific. And here we break it down a little bit. The first thing is clear division of labor. You only do what you are ordered to do. So if you're a typist, you type, you don't do anything else. The paradox here with that is that we've taught you one function and you become really, really good at it. But it makes it difficult should we need to move you into another location or into another function, because you won't have the skill set necessary. You became highly effective within your particular job. Clear hierarchy of authority. You know exactly what the structure is within your organization. Formal rules and procedures. Everything is defined by rules. And also in personality. And again, this is the connection with other people. A career based on merit. You don't have the skills, you don't go anywhere. That's just the philosophy. So if you have the ability, you can continue to move forward. If you continue to learn more and more things, you can continue to move up, but only in your particular category. The disadvantages, of course, are also in this area. So excessive paperwork or red tape. It's often said that you're duplicating everything. Bureaucracy tends to be that way, where everything has to be triplicate. The reality is there's just a lot of rules and regulations. Slowness in handling problems. Again, you're highly specialized, and of course, things have to be moved from one department to another before ratification or any kind of resolutions can take place. Rigidity in the face of shifting needs. Don't care. Think of the government. That's a bureaucracy. You need something done, takes forever to get it done. Resistance to change. Think of the government. They don't want to change. Employee apathy. Quite frankly, people who work in those environments, they do enjoy themselves, but they have very limited futures. Within a regular company, you learn a little bit of everything. You can move in any direction. But when you are in a bureaucracy, you can only move in one direction in the company or the organization or the department or the function that you are performing. And it can only be moving in that direction. It's very difficult to jump from one department to another unless they need the same task. So before I go into this second part, I'm going to show you another video. The second video is on the Hawthorne study. So we're going to take a quick look at this one as well. Let's just open up the Hawthorne.
The Roaring Twenties, an era of excitement like few others in American history. An era of uproar in, well, everything. A scandalous dance called the Charleston caught on, bringing hemlines up so they could swing to the new music. Ladies bobbed their hair and covered it with cloche hats. The noble experiment tried vainly to erase demon drink from America. Speakeasies, though, became as common as prohibition agents, and bootleggers were both the heroes and the villains of the age. Scarface Al Capone was a legendary example. Harding headlined the executive branch and Teapot Dome, but America kept cool with Coolidge. A young pilot named Charles Lindbergh flew non-stop across the Atlantic and shrank the world, earning its lasting adulation. The incomparable Babe Ruth, too, was known and loved throughout the world. But perhaps the grandest star of the era was the automobile. Nothing in the 20s revolutionized the lifestyle of Americans more than the incredible motor car. Henry Ford's development of the assembly line boosted both employment and wages and set off the modern American industrial revolution. Everywhere, more and more people went to work in factories, turning out products by the hundreds of millions. But somewhere along the assembly line, the workers often got lost in the rush of production. Considered an extension of the machinery, the industrial man was often less important than his output. Working conditions were difficult, supervision usually autocratic, and benefits non-existent for most workers. In sweatshops and even in better factories, it was production that mattered. At Western Electric's Hawthorne Works in Chicago in the 1920s, telephone equipment was being manufactured by 40,000 people. What Hawthorne employees had received their company-paid pension plan back in 1906. They had vacations 1 week after 5 years, and they had sickness disability pay. Hawthorne was considered a progressive place to work.
Those who worked at Hawthorne were really respected in the neighborhood. It was considered quite a privilege to be working here.
At this and 3 other companies in 1924, the National Academy of Science began an experiment to determine how illumination affects worker efficiency. The premise was that output would improve if the lighting of work areas was improved. Something very curious happened when new experimental lights were installed. Output went up among those employees being studied, and also among those whose lighting had not been changed. And most puzzling of all, it continued to go up even when lights were turned down. Having proved nothing, these studies were called off by the National Academy. It might all have ended there. Relay making was picked for a new experiment when Western Electric alone decided to probe the inconclusive results of the illumination studies. 6 young women assembled the electromagnetic switches while rest breaks and different hours were tried. It was the core of what would later be called the Hawthorne Studies, industry's first scientific inquiry into employee attitudes. Continuing changes in routine were freely discussed with the workers, whose output as well as involvement in the project increased dramatically. Each completed relay was counted by a tireless tape, which recorded an overall production increase of 30%. In this small room for more than 5 years, observers studied workers producing more in less time than ever before. Industrial history was in the making. The Hawthorne-Harvard Cooperative Inquiry continued into the 30s, delving into production areas all over the plant. When the early returns from the relay room began to be understood, the investigators felt the attitudes of other workers ought to be explored. They began industry's first formal employee interviewing program. Some 20,000 Hawthorne people aired their feelings about their jobs, their supervisors, their working conditions, about anything and everything. In other experiments, investigators found the first clues to the social organization of people at work, an organization that seemed to have as much or even more impact on output than anything management did. Though not all the results were as dramatic as the relay room, in general, output increased wherever these tests were tried. The investigators found industry had never tapped the workers' real worth and sent the massive proof back to Harvard for compilation.
The point of view which gradually emerged from the studies was to regard a business organization as a social system. Everyone knows that people are important in business, but a way of thinking which allowed the satisfactions and dissatisfactions of workers to be thought about in relationship to output and productivity, and to allow new studies and new actions to be taken, had not been available before. This is the real contribution of the Hawthorne studies.
Fantastic. So Hawthorne. So when we're actually looking at one of these things that people learn, some of the different elements, such as how do workers function, what happens when you modify their breaks, what happens when you modify their hours, it all has an impact in one form or another. If I provide more light, or let's say a cleaner environment, what will be the impact? How will it affect people? And different elements affect different people in different ways. So once again, it's a question of management learning about all of these different principles and being able to apply them a little bit. So we want to answer this question here. What insights come from behavioral management approaches? And there's a number of things that we want to take a look at. So behavioral management, human resource approaches, we've talked about the Follett's notion of organization as communities, the Hawthorne studies, which actually took place during the 20s, Maslow's theory of human needs, the multi-level structure, McGregor's theory of X and Y, and we talked about McGregor before and Maslow, and Agris's theory of adult personalities. So each of these need to be evaluated a little bit because they do teach us a great deal about how people behave and how we can recognize certain behavioral characteristics. So when we're looking at all 5 of these, and we are going to break them down a little bit as well, each one of them actually has a dramatic impact on how people are perceived and what we can recognize as, let's say, standardized or globalized behavioral traits of individuals. Let's just come back to this again. Fantastic. So Mary Parker Follett, organizations or cooperative communities of managers and workers. That's the whole idea that people are collectively working together. And also groups are mechanisms through which individuals can combine their talents and also their greater good. And once again, we need to cultivate these characteristics so that people are collectively working as a, let's say, a unified group rather than individuals. So whenever you get individuals working on their own, you end up with issues. Issues where people no longer communicate very well. And of course, you run into other situations as well, usually personality conflicts. The manager's job is to help the people in the organization get together, work together on one particular subject or one particular direction. So this is achieving the goals of that particular organization or the interests of that particular organization. Again, forward-looking management insights should create feelings of collective responsibility so that each person feels they belong to the family. And when you belong to a family, you have a propensity to work together and try to help one another. And you're always moving in the same particular direction, or at least you should be. Employees to share in the business itself. In other words, they feel like they belong to it and it's not something isolated from them. Once again, one of the characteristics here is they must perceive how they fit in. And sometimes the managers need to kind of help the employee understand. If an employee is only doing one tiny little function, let's just say they put a pickle on a hamburger. Well, they don't see how they fit in. So at some point, you have to stop and show them that without them putting that pickle on, the individual wouldn't have that nice spicy taste that they get from having a pickle on the hamburger. Again, it's really a question of making sure that everybody recognizes their position in a company. And today, profit sharing is also possible, and these are things that we look forward to. So forward-looking managers are trying to implement strategies of reward and let's say getting them to function more clearly. The Hawthorne studies, well, there were quite a few different things discovered there. In the 1920s, so 1924, initial study examined how economic incentives and also physical conditions affected the workers' output. And there was no consistent relationship. And this is really fascinating because some people react and some people didn't. But there was nothing consistent. The key discoveries that were made was psychological factors influencing the results. Just because things were being, let's say, mixed up a little bit, people tended to find that as more interesting, more curious, and tended to work more effectively. So by changing things from time to time, it's actually not a bad thing to do. It stimulates activity within the environment. Hawthorne study also relay assembly test room studies. Well, this brought us some extra information, manipulating the working conditions to assist the impact and also the output, changing the breaks and the workday length. Again, there was no link found, and yet they continued because of the mix-up, the change. Change in routine has a real impact on people. So even though there was no link found between changing the breaks and the work length, it did change the personality and the behavior of the individuals. So work did increase and they did accomplish a little bit more. Factors that accounted for the increased productivity was the atmosphere. It's changed. Somebody mixed it up a little bit. And also participative supervision. So people became more involved and therefore you felt more like you belonged and things were changing and it looked better. Lessons learned from the study. Again, social and human concerns are key to productivity. Having this kind of symbiotic relationship with your environment, and your environment is changing, but it's also at the same time, let's say, you're connected to it like a family unit, tends to be one of the most important elements. And the Hawthorne effect, people who are singled out for special attention perform as expected. This is actually, there's a really good lesson in this one here. And this goes to a school in the United States. There is a school that was heavily recorded, and this was in Chicago. One of the schools there, they had tremendous impact. the students were so bad in this particular school that there are places in the States where I simply don't go. I just refuse to go into those areas. Detroit is one of them, especially the low areas of the central core. There are certain places that are just dangerous. And they had a school which was very well documented. In fact, they've even made movies about it. And a number of people have actually talked a great deal about it as well. One of the interesting things is this particular school, several teachers had been stabbed. They had their cars smashed and their tires slashed. And several teachers left the school refusing to work. And it was only a few days after the beginning of the school year. So they were desperate. And the principal of the school read a book on positive thought and positive demeanors and character and how you can actually change an environment. And it was an older book. And it was a young woman in Florida who was looking for a job as a teacher. She was a brand spanking new teacher, and she was looking for an opportunity. And she recognized that the only thing she's ever going to get for at least for maybe the first 4 or 5 years is substitution. So she's going to fit in for a week here, a week there, a day here, what have you. And she saw this ad in Chicago for a full-time position. And she figured, I'm taking that one. So she contacted the principal. The principal said, come on up and I'll introduce you around. And as soon as she went up, she's looking at it, and it's probably what you would call a nightmare school. Painting everywhere, people, really nasty attitudes, the kids. And she thought, well, this is going to be her future, so she's going to take that job. She took the job, and the principal gave her a list of all the students that were in her class, and none of them had passed anything. This is probably one of the worst areas of Chicago. And also, it was the president's worst school. Now, in the United States, schools are listed based on the president's choice, which means that they're in the high level, depending on the state they're in, or they're in the worst possible level, which is the lowest level. And that school was the lowest. So she took on the class, and within a year, she turned out some of the smartest kids in that school. And when Oprah, and this was actually on Oprah as well, so I do remember Oprah talking to her. Oprah had the principal and herself there. And Oprah said, you know something, we've read a lot about this story. The president actually gave a special award to the school because of your students. They did so well. And she said, well, they were the best. I mean, I was very fortunate. They were the best students in the school. And she said, how do you determine that? How did you figure that out? This is Oprah. And the principal's kind of turning his head and laughing a little bit. Now, she asked the principal, this is Oprah, why are you laughing? And he said, well, they weren't exactly the best. And the teacher said, no, they were the best. Here, I have a list of them. And she's showing their IQs. Their IQs are way up there in the 200s. And the principal started laughing out loud. And of course, Oprah saying, what is that? And she said, the principal turned around and said, well, that's their locker number. That's not their IQ. But the teacher believed it was their IQ, and that's the way she treated them. So there is a lot to be said for the psychological approach. Social and human concerns, they really are key. And when you actually look at an individual and you center them out as being highly intelligent, they tend to live up to it. And this is what happened in that school. And by the way, that's only one example. There are many examples like that, especially with schools in the US, schools that were really doing extremely poorly. They got teachers that didn't know the history, and they treated the students differently. And of course, they reacted differently. So the Hawthorne study is actually based on very good recognition of what the behavioral characteristics are and what causes them. Maslow, and we've talked about Maslow both in the introduction to business and also human resources. And we've talked about it in other ways as well. The needs of psychological and physiological deficiencies a person feels compelled to satisfy. There are only a few layers that an individual needs to acquire. We recognize these in the staff. When an individual is afraid to communicate with other people and they kind of stick to themselves a little bit, maybe a new employee, then you recognize that they're at that fundamental level. And we're going to take a look at each one of these levels here. Okay. So there's our 5 levels. The physiological level means they must feel like they're okay. They have some kind of job. The job is okay. They feel adequate within that particular job, but they're still learning it. So there's a little trepidation there. And then, of course, as they begin to feel a little bit more secure in themselves, we also recognize this within the employee. For some employees, it's quick. For others, it takes time. But eventually, they begin to feel like it's safe. It's a safe environment. They're not going to lose their job because they screwed up or something of that nature. So they feel safer, and now they're prepared to either stay at that particular level of thought, or they begin to want to connect with other people. And this is the social element. So now if they've decided it's okay, it's safe, and they don't have to retreat back into safety or physiological states, psychological states, then they actually will go on to socialize with other employees and they start to connect a little bit more. Eventually, they begin to have more self-esteem within themselves and more accomplishment. And therefore, then they can move on to a higher level, which is self-actualization. So we kind of look at it as an indicator as to the dynamics of the environment of our particular employee base, how they're interacting with one another, and what are some of the areas that they may not actually be prepared to move forward with. Maybe it is safety. Maybe they don't feel like they're doing a good enough job. Well, maybe a little encouragement is going to help them to break down the safety paradox and move on to the social, and now they can connect with the rest of the staff. So we look at it under those 5 levels. Self-actualization at the top, and they often show this as a pyramid. Self-esteem or esteem, social needs, safety needs, and of course the psychological. So the base is the basics of all human needs. They just simply need to make sure that they are able to feed themselves, they can access water, they can clothe themselves, they have maybe the ability to have an apartment for themselves, but it doesn't necessarily mean they feel safe within the environment. So that's the next level. And there's no guarantee that if they accomplish one, they'll move on to the next one. And this is also why managers need to be able to communicate with their staff and break down some of those barriers by helping them, by giving them encouragement to move forward or training or whatever it happens to be, until they do feel like the position is protected. They're not going to lose their jobs. And then once they've done that, they begin to connect with other people much more openly. Each one of these levels shows us a great deal about the competency of that particular individual. And just because they're highly competent in one area doesn't mean they're competent in all areas. So this is variable. Maybe at work, they have reached the social level, but maybe at home, they've reached the self-actualization level. And maybe they have some little club that they belong to, and they're only at the esteem level. But it's variable depending on what they're actually achieving and accomplishing. So once again, managers can use these models, this Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, to kind of determine where is my staff situated mentally and behaviorally. So again, just to personify this a little bit, the deficit principle, and also the progression principle. You need to know both of these as well. The deficit principle is a satisfied need is not a motivator of behavior. So it doesn't necessarily mean, yes, you achieve the safety level. In fact, you now feel competent, you feel safe within your environment. You don't feel you're going to lose your apartment or your house or your boyfriend, girlfriend, or what have you, or you feel safe in yourself. But it doesn't mean you're going to socialize. So this is what it's really talking about. The deficit principle doesn't mean you're going to move to the next level. You could always regress. And also progressive principle. So progression principle, a need becomes a motivator. Once the preceding lower level need is satisfied, you can move to the next level. So safety, you now feel safe and you can move on to social. This is the way we actually recognize what is the behavior within the office environment. Remember, you want people who are collectively working together. And sometimes you have to intervene a little bit with a smile, or you have to go in and pat somebody on the back, or tell them how good of a job they're doing to kind of motivate them to move forward and to be able to connect with other people. So these two are important to us as well, deficit and also progressive with the Maslow. There is another approach, and we've talked about this one in the Intro to Business. This is the McGregor theory of X and Y. And of course, in that particular course, I told you the one thing to remember with X and Y was that X is always the negative. So negative X, Y is a positive. So let's take a look at this one. Oops. Better if we move forward, right? There we go. So the X theory here, when we look at employees, we can kind of define them. Are they positive natured or are they negative natured? Again, we can intervene if we can recognize the traits. So these are people who don't like the work. Well, what can we do? We can try to give them work that they will like, and therefore we can move them from X to Y. Lack ambition, probably because they don't like the work or they don't like you. It's quite possible. So they lack any kind of ambition because they don't see how they fit in, and they have no need to move forward. Are irresponsible, or they resist change. They just don't like things changing on them, and prefer to be led. They want you to hold their hand and take them from one job to the next, or one task to the next, or tell them step by step what to do. Eventually, they can move away from that. Once they become competent, they will actually gravitate to become a Y person. But in the interim, they don't like the work because they don't feel they can do it very well. Maybe that's the reason. Again, we look at these things so that we can get a better perspective. When it comes to the Y side of it, well, there you go. When it comes to the Y side of it, these are the positive influences. So we recognize that the individual really enjoys working. I often look at dislikes work and willing to work as the equivalency of somebody driving to work. Somebody's going 2 miles an hour because they don't want to go to work, and the other one's going like 150,000 miles a second because they want to get there before anybody else. So willing to work and also capable of self-control. They have control over themselves and they can therefore focus very clearly. It's also willing to accept responsibility, whereas with the X theory, people don't want the responsibility. They want you to lead them step by step by step. And also highly imaginative and creative in the way they do things. So they figured their own way out. They know how to do something because they found a shortcut that makes them feel good about themselves. And capable of self-direction. You don't have to stand there and hold their hand. They're willing to take control of their own destiny. And most people who are in this Y category, they definitely want to be able to accomplish things on their own. You give them a task to do, you don't have to tell them because they'll just go ahead and do it. They really want to accomplish it ASAP. They want to get it done. They want to show how they can do it. So some of those implications for managers, we can recognize the behavioral characteristics of people. Managers create self-fulfilling prophecies. The way you treat an employee, that employee is going to reciprocate. So if you treat the employee as if they don't like their job, they're not going to enjoy it. If you treat them as if they always seem to enjoy it, they're going to enjoy it in spite of themselves. You do this to your children as well. When a child doesn't feel good about themselves, you tell them that they're incredibly brilliant children and that they're going to succeed in spite of everything. And they begin to slowly live up to your expectations. It may not happen as fast as you want it to, but the more you encourage positivity and you show them what they're doing, it's not whitewash, you're actually showing them this is what you're doing and I'm really excited by it, then they will do better at it. They'll try harder to accomplish it. So Theory X managers create situations where workers become dependent. These are the micromanagers. These are the people who tell you everything to do. You know, you got to do it my way to get it done. But you need to give them enough leeway so that they can learn how to explore their own creativity and their own skill set in some particular way. That's how you build a strong workforce, is you allow them to grow and to expand. Theory Y managers create situations where workers respond with initiative and also high performance. Sometimes you give them little teeny weeny, let's say, projects to do. I'll give you a great example. When I was a teenager, I worked at NCR, National Cash Register. I worked there for over 10 years as a senior console operator, which meant I literally operated the data center. And what was interesting about that is they hired a woman from, if I remember correctly, it was Control Data. And the woman had only one function. She just typed into these cards, and they would make these cards you used to feed into a computer. Don't do it anywhere. Well, you do it some places. But these cards, they're punch cards, and that's all she had to do. However, it's a very, very mundane job. There's no excitement into it whatsoever. They gave this woman an opportunity. She came in one day with a cupcake for one of the staff members who had a birthday. And the manager decided to give her a budget of a couple of dollars. I think it was $2 a month or what have you. And she could actually control, and her project was to ensure that anybody who had a birthday, we would celebrate it. She could buy balloons or something, and she always brought a cake. So we always had a cake when somebody had a birthday. But I can tell you that her face lit up. The fact that she was in control of this and she could do it her way, it was really exciting. And it actually gave everybody else in the office a real smile as well, simply because we recognize there were opportunities now. So this is a Y personality when you change the dynamics and let people actually move forward. Central to notion of empowerment and also self-management. Agris's theory of adult personalities is another area. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier as well. It's the personality and organization. So classical management principles and practices apply in this case. Inhibited workers' maturation and inhibits worker maturation, and also inconsistent with the nature of adult personalities. And the next one, of course, is management practices should accommodate the mature personality in a variety of different ways. And one of them is increasing the task responsibility. If an individual has something to do and it's mundane and it has no future, you can't see where you're going, you don't know how you fit into the organization, people become very despondent. They don't like going to work anymore. They become quieter in their desk. They don't want to connect all the time because they don't see how they fit in, and they're not as safe as they might have been, let's say, a little earlier, a year ago, 2 years ago. So increasing the responsibility that the individual has and ensuring that that individual is cognizant that they're very important, they're an important cog within the machinery of that company, then they tend to really react well. They become more mature, they actually participate more, and also increasing the variety, which gives them the ability to be creative. Even though we're really talking about a more Y personality rather than an X personality. With the Y personality, they're more interested in variety because they can be more creative. They can be more stimulated, more triggered to do things that are different. And that actually makes the whole life experience more valuable in a sense. So sometimes it's just that simple little thing like put on a birthday party for people, bring in a couple of balloons, or maybe it's some other little task like health and safety, or maybe I'm going to ask you if you could do the inventory today. And because you're the best person to do this, well, the next thing you know, they're excited because it's their project. And again, they're a little bit more responsive to the company. Using participative decision making, let them make their own decisions. This is oftentimes one of the fastest ways of getting somebody who's kind of separating themselves mentally from the organization, getting them to come back to the organization mentally, is oftentimes let them make decisions for themselves. Again, you hired them, you trained them, you prepared them, you implemented them into a particular function, and you did so because they're the person who can do the job. Let them do the job. And that will actually give them a great deal of encouragement and also inner strength and creativity. Fantastic. So part 2 of this particular course deals with learning from the past. And in this case here, management learning past to present. We want to take a look at what is the future like for business and for management. So what are the foundations of modern thinking when it comes to management? And we've seen the old ways. Now let's take a look at some of these newer ways. So foundations for continuing development in management. We are now looking at a variety of different tools that we've learned from the past, and we're now exploring them in different ways. So quantitative analysis and tools, and we're going to take a look at each one of these. Systems view of organizations. Also contingency thinking, what if scenarios, and commitment to quality, and learning organizations. Biggest change that has taken place in the last few years, a lot of companies are putting a lot of emphasis and training into their staff, and also evidence-based management. So these are areas that we definitely are learning a great deal about when it comes to developing the core let's say, functions within the organization. The study of how organizations produce goods and services. Well, let's take a look. Quantitative analysis and tools. Again, it is a simple approach of breaking things down and then evaluating and analyzing the impact. So the scientific application of mathematical techniques to management problems. We want to break it down. We want to see how does it interact with one another. mathematical forecasting. And again, most of this is done on a computer. So there are a lot of programs out there nowadays that allow us to break it down. How many hours are required, how many products were created, how much motion took place, how much electricity was used. We can break everything down and evaluate what are the core consistent components. So making future projections useful for planning. If I want to know what is the maximum potential of a machine, what is the maximum potential of a person using that machine? Again, we want to break it down a little bit. Inventory modeling, controlling inventories mathematically. This is an area where most managers really have to learn how to control things. Inventory is a killer of the budget that you have. You only have a certain amount of money, and the more inventory you're allowing to accumulate, the more your money is frozen and you can't use it. So you want to make sure that you are controlling how much of anything you are acquiring and where you're storing it, etc. Linear programming, calculating how to allocate all of those scarce resources that you have available to you. How are you going to use them? And when will you use them? And also queuing theory, allocating this, let's say the service personal workstations to minimize service costs and also customer waiting time. Well, we're really looking at how can we reduce the overall impact of the infrastructure. If a customer makes a telephone call for service and we take 5 minutes to respond, that may not be a good thing. What if we had a different approach to it? Well, many companies have actually switched to not just telephone, but also using a daisy chain system with messaging. And therefore, they can handle many different complaints or many different queries all at the same time, in a sense, within minutes. So queuing theory as well. And the network model. So breaking large tasks into smaller components for better coordination. Anything that seems overwhelming, when you break it down into bite-sized chunks, it becomes simplistic. It really is simplistic. When you actually break any problem down, no matter how big that problem is, it's no longer a big problem. It's just bite-sized chunks, or let's say minor little steps in a particular direction. Every time you take a step, then you take a look at the next bite, and you then take that step, and then you take a look at the next one. So there is no such thing as, let's say, a problem that is just too big. It's a question of control yourself, break it down, do one thing at a time, and get through all of them, step by step by step. So organization and systems. The system's a collection of interrelated parts that function together to achieve a common purpose. We're really trying to gather as much information as possible and be able to apply it to something that we can evaluate and analyze. Subsystems, a smaller component of a larger system. The more we can break it down, the easier and the more visible it becomes. I remember one particular situation at IBM where they were using mind maps, and they had executives from all over the world in that particular office. And they all had a sheet of paper on the wall, and they were supposed to figure out how they communicate between the offices. And after using their mind maps, they actually made major discoveries of some of the inadequacies because they couldn't fill in certain blanks that were necessary to communicate with other offices. There were some parts missing, and it was only when they broke it all down that they could actually see what was missing. So sometimes breaking down a system into subsystems is really important. Open systems, organizations that interact with their environment in the, let's say, the continual process of transforming resources and inputs and outputs. So again, we recognize that we have systems and we need to know how everything functions. If we can break it down, we can analyze it. If you can analyze it, you can see where the disparities or the gaps are. And here's a good example of it. Organizations is a complex network of interactive subsystems. Yeah, I recognize that we have a marketing, we have a human resource department, we have an inventory system, we have we have information technology for computers and stuff like that, counting system. Well, information comes into that environment, something happens, and then there's an outcome that is given to the customer. It's recognizing these systems and then breaking them down even further that gives us a clear indicator as to what might be missing, what might be duplicated, and how the interaction between the departments functions. And maybe what we'll discover is, as you see this diagram, where all 5 of those little circles, what happens if that center circle is just a slight less, let's say it's moved to the right and down slightly, so it's not really touching the marketing and sales. Then we recognize there is something missing between these departments and they're not communicating very well. This often happens with sales and marketing, that they don't communicate very well at all. So sometimes you have to figure out what is it and break it down and take a closer look at it. Again, how do we analyze something? We have to really break it apart and take a look at it and see how the components function together and separately. And here we have contingency. Well, what happens if? What do we do? Trying to match managerial responses with problems and opportunities unique to various situations that can occur. I got news for you. Things can happen so fast. It's absolutely shocking sometimes. You may have a customer phone you up and you are ready to deliver something and they don't want it anymore. You'd be surprised how many liquidation sales are taking place right now, especially in the States. Oh my God, you can buy truckloads of everything simply because the customers won't take them anymore. The stores are saying, send it back. I don't care. I don't want it. So what do you do? What do you do if your workers decide not to come to work? Well, for the Board of Education, this is a serious problem right now. Most of the teachers don't want to go back to work. So here you have some serious problems. So how do you deal with the what if? You must plan in advance for the possibility of a contingency. So especially individuals and also environmental differences. And no one way is the best way. There is no such thing. There's just what you can do. And sometimes you plan well in advance to do something, and then you discover, well, you can't really do that, but at least you have an idea as to what direction you can go. So there is no one best way to management. There are many different potentials. And appropriate ways to manage depends on the situation. And it really does, because situations change as time goes on. Many different variables come into play. Maybe it is a question of maybe employees don't want to come to work. Maybe somebody gets in a car accident and it's essential that they meet with a customer. Well, too bad, so sad. They're not going to meet the customer. So what are you going to do? You better have a plan in mind to deal with that situation. Again, it's that contingency. What will I do if a scenario pops up? And again, you'll know in advance fundamentally what could go wrong within your department. Quality management. There is a very strict philosophy in this particular area. You recognize you're not the only fish in the sea. There's a lot of competitors out there. So quality and competitive advantage are linked together simply because if you reduce slightly, your competition will actually move in and take your business away from you. So you need to actually make sure that your quality remains better than anybody else, and your competitive advantage, whatever that happens to be, more product or better product in some particular way recognized by the customer. So total quality management, and remember this axiom. So TQM, total quality management, comprehensive approach to continuous quality, improving for a total organization. You're constantly, continuously trying to do better. Your whole business, it's not just one department, but the whole business is working towards a better organization. Creating the context for the value chain as well, and also certification. As you probably know, there are a lot of companies out there that are ISO certified. There are several designations within ISO, and there are companies who will not do business with you unless you are. Walmart, for one, will not do business with any company that is not ISO certified, and they have to have these qualifications. What ISO does is it provides a company with certification that it follows a very specific methodology of business. So there is a structural policy that defines every function within the company, and it is easy enough to connect to those departments if you need them. So ISO certification, continuous improvements, every company needs to constantly be working on the organization. They need to make sure that they're continuing to stay on top, and therefore the quality and their competitive advantage has to remain high priority for a company, because your competition will not be waiting for you. They're not waiting for you to move ahead. They're going to do it for you. One of the other areas is knowledge management and organizational learning. Knowledge management is the process of using information technology to achieve performance success. As I said, there's actually a lot of different applications out there. Here they have a good example of it, your intellectual assets. So your portfolio, it could be patents, copyrights, trade secrets, intellectual property rights. Depending on the type of organization, there may be a particular method you use which no one else can use. And therefore that gives you an advantage, a very competitive advantage. Accumulation of knowledge of the entire workforce. Remember, you've trained these people. You are constantly looking for people who embellish and add a great deal to your particular organization. And these individuals will do so, and that means this becomes your property in a sense. So learning organizations, once again, organizations that are able to continually learn and adapt to new circumstances. The only thing that can really destroy a company is its inability to move and move forward. And I've tried to explain many times different things that can cause a problem in a company. One of the biggest ones is the lack of creativity. The inability to use the equipment, the machinery, the people within a company, and be able to leverage it within, let's say, their particular industry. A lot of companies have amazing capability. You'd be surprised at some of the machinery out there and some of the knowledge that people have. They're brilliant individuals, but are you utilizing their resources properly? I gave you the example of Xiaopin, a very close friend of mine. She has over 100 patents, and she's a chemist. She's an expert in her particular field, biochemistry. This is a very interesting individual because, let's face it, if you hired this person and you didn't give them the ability to do what they do best, in other words, you put them in charge of something where they can actually create something new for you, it would be a real waste of resources. A lot of companies nowadays are actually recognizing this, and they're creating entrepreneurs within the company. So your own company is saying, wait a minute now, because you may have some aspirations, then we'll let you go ahead with your project and we'll kind of fund you a little bit as long as we get to use that product. Well, this may be to your advantage in a big way. A lot of companies are looking at that model. And the rationality, once again, is because these resources would not be utilized properly by the company in its current state. So, unfortunately, a lot of companies do go broke. And it's not because they don't have the capability or the wherewithal, they just don't know how to use it properly. So, learning organizations is really important. Core ingredients include the mental model, personal mastery, systems thinking, shared vision, team learning. We want people to use the skills to the best effect that they possibly can, and to be able to manipulate the environment that they're in such a way that it gives the company an advantage in some particular way. So once again, learning environments and learning organizations, it's important for a manager to be willing to invest in their employees and be able to invest within the resources that they need within that particular department or organization. So what makes a difference for managers is that they're working in an organization that literally perpetuates the philosophy that everybody inside the company is really important. They recognize the fact that the employees are the most important element within that organization. So organizations that consistently achieve excellence while creating a high quality work environment, they're the ones that are really people oriented. They're valuing the people, they're teaching those individuals, they're incorporating their skills, they're looking for the opportunities and the ideas that they have, the team orientation. A lot of people have discovered that when you work within a collective and you're all working towards the same end, people tend to work harder. It's almost like being in a micro family where you're all trying to help one another to succeed. And this is a really powerful element. So team oriented is another one where they've recognized people work really well in a team. And information oriented, once again, providing you with up-to-date information means using good technology. And it also means mobilizing some of that technology so that it can actually help you with whatever you need to achieve. Achievement oriented, once again, focusing on the needs of the customer and also the stakeholders. You always have to remember one thing. Business only exists for one reason, and that is to satisfy a need for the customer. So you're trying to accomplish something specifically for your customer. And everything, the whole organization is evolved around that one premise. I'm going to do something for the customer. Learning oriented, once again, operating with the internal cultures that respect the facilities of learning and making sure that the people within the company and the company as a whole is constantly changing as the environment changes. You know, sometimes a company comes into existence and they're really gung-ho and they're doing their work and they're producing a super product, but they tend to forget sometimes that nothing stays stagnant. Everything changes. Industries change overnight. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they continue, but they mutate into something a little different. So you have to stick with it. You have to stay on top of these things. And that means you have to educate the people. You have to learn from the experience of monitoring and analyzing what is happening in your particular industry. One of the other areas we talked about was evidence-based management. So making your decisions based on the information that you've been able to gather. So this also means that one of your functions is to evaluate, to control the information flow, to be able to gather what you need and make proper decisions, be able to move forward with them. So making management decisions on hard facts about what's really working and what's not working. If you don't look carefully, you sometimes miss the obvious. Evidence shows positive human resource management practices increase sales and also increase profits. Well, of course it does if you get the right people in those positions. But if you're just simply making judgment calls based on, let's say, appearances rather than the skill sets that are coming forward, sometimes you make a decision based on, oh, that's a cute person, or they look kind of nice, or they look kind of good. But you have to look at the skill sets that are being brought forward. They're going to augment the performance of the company. So employment security is one of the areas, and this is for the human resource. Also selecting the right people. And once again, it requires that your human resource people are insightful enough to be able to recognize the patterns of good development and good individuals with good skill sets and let's say proper behavioral traits. Remember, if the behavioral traits don't fit the company's outlook, then nothing is going to happen. You're just going to end up with people who get very upset. Self-managing teams. Remember, when people actually have a little bit of control, but they do know that there are ramifications for non-compliance, as long as they can control and they can literally manage themselves, they really do outperform. In some cases, they actually overwork. They will actually put in more hours than they actually should be putting in, but they do it because of a desire to achieve. And we want them to be able to believe that they are a very active part within the company. High based on merit, again, these are things that we've learned a great deal about in the history, and we're learning a great deal about it now as well. However, there are some pitfalls here and social pitfalls for managers. Sometimes it does have to be based on merit, because if you just simply give people increases without merit, then it becomes an expectation. And that means that work will actually drop off. Benchmarks for performance will be diminished simply because the individual will begin to associate the fact that they're going to get paid whether they do well or not. So why bother? And of course, we recognize from the last course that training and development is really important. You get what you pay for. And if you're willing to pay a little bit of development time into somebody, you're going to get it back as long as it was well thought out. So training and development, you're going to build up a resource. The only thing you have to be careful of is sometimes people will get that training and development and they'll move on to better opportunities. And again, you got to keep in mind, everybody wants something a little bit better. So there is that possibility. And reducing status distinctions. Well, this is something that some businesses do. I know that the Disney Corporation considers this to be a useful way of looking at things, where people are basically equal in some form or another, reducing the status. And also shared information. Once again, one of the things that is really important is how people perceive themselves as either connected to the company or not. If you want to isolate somebody in your family, don't tell them something. Tell everybody else in the family but them. And they literally will begin to disassociate with the family. So it's the same thing here. I want to make sure that the people within the organization are receiving the right kind of knowledge, the right kind of information. And again, this is also part of the human resource management. So managers moving forward, managers have to excel. You really have to start to step up, learn more, explore more, experiment more. You really do have to begin to acquire some of that knowledge about the psychology of things. What you're really trying to do is connect with people. But there is a danger here too. You don't want to connect too much so that you show favoritism, but you want to know and understand your staff and what motivates them, what doesn't motivate them, what is the best combination of employees to work side by side or together, when to form teams, when not to, how to administrate, let's say, your resources, how to implement them properly. There's a few things that you want to really understand. Some of the attributes that you need as a manager. Well, global strategies, understanding the interconnections among nations, cultures, and economies. As I've said many times now, your competition is worldwide, and you have to be aware of the fact that you're competing with countries all over the world, companies everywhere. And some of them are not paying anywhere near what you pay for your resources. So in some countries, I was looking at Thailand. Thailand on the weekend, there's a woman was building a house, and it cost her 1 million baht, which is the equivalency of about $40,000. And that's to build a beautiful, beautiful house, a really big house, something like 3,000 square feet. And it's only $40,000. This is why so many people go to retire in Thailand. And it's really cheap. So when you're competing with countries that don't pay very much in their wages, and their infrastructure is designed so that their resources are even cheaper, it's really difficult sometimes. So you have to manage based on what you know, and you have to learn about your particular industry. Mastering the technology just simply means mastering the programs that you would use to analyze your resources and how you implement them. Remember, one of the things that you want to do is create models so you can evaluate, what would happen if we introduced 10 new units? What would happen if I brought in 2 new printers? What would happen if I hired 1 more staff member? We have to analyze these things. You have to know what the impact is. What is the impact financially? What is the impact for space? What is the impact of the individual coming into the environment? Now you have an extra person. So there's a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration. And also you need to step up a little bit in motivating and coaching your particular staff and training your staff and giving them the opportunities that are necessary. Once again, most companies nowadays are looking for speed. Whatever it is, no matter what kind of job it is, they're looking for you to have a pass-through rate where input comes in, you do what you need to do, output goes out faster than ever before. So whatever the process is you're doing, they want it done faster, and they want you to do more of it. So we have to be aware of this, and you have to inspire the people who are doing the task so that they're not breaking down on you, and that they're able to do it because you provided them with the resources that give them that advantage. And models of ethical behavior, acting ethical in all ways possible. Again, it's really important for managers because you're like the head of the family. Your department is your family and you're the head of it. And they look to you for guidance. They look for you for everything that is necessary, all the resources, everything. So you have to be a very ethical person. Otherwise, they themselves will reciprocate. They will become your mirror image. And you want to have the right mirror image. So the good news is that's that chapter, which is kind of nice. Any questions so far? Yes, no, maybe, could be, should be, nobody, somebody, anybody?
No, no questions.
No questions yet? Oh my God. So I'm just putting a few files into the chat. Just a few. Okay, so there's a few. I'm going to put one more in here. I'm just looking for it at the moment. So give me 1 second to find it. And this is the review for the quiz tomorrow. So quiz number 1. Review, review, review. Where are you? Second. Fantastic. So this particular document that I'm sharing with you here as well is the review questions for the quiz. This is the quiz that you'll be doing tomorrow. This is the first one, which is chapter 1 and chapter 2. So you should be able to answer all of these questions. There's not very many here. Fantastic. And this will be done on Brightspace. Piece of cake. So in addition to that, I've given you the PowerPoints, and I've given you a couple of different files here as well. Let me just open that up again. So one of these files is your student notes, but there's another one here which I'd like you to do tonight, and I'd like you to spend a little bit of time with it. The first part of it is a breakdown of Taylor, so Frederick Taylor. And then the second file that I gave you are the questions I'd like you to fill out. Whoops, if it opens. Okay, and here's some questions. You should be able to answer these questions in order to make more sense of these 4 people. Again, Frederick Taylor, Henry Foyle, and Max Weber, and of course, Mary Parker Follett. You should be able to answer most of these questions based on that original biology here, or biography, I should say. And it's for each one of them. So it'll give you a better insight into each one of these individuals and what they're responsible for and what was unique about what they discovered. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, it does.
Fantastic. Let's just put that aside. Okay, guys, so what I'm going to do is let you go and work on that for the time being. You definitely want to go through that breakdown of those questions and also take a look at the quiz and go over some of the areas that you might not be too sure about. Again, within the book, it's chapter number 2. Did you actually get your book, Kuntisa? Kuntisa, blah, blah. Fantastic. Did you find
It's okay.
You got it?
I can't remember her. I keep forgetting her name, but she's supposed to send me the information that, well, she said around 3:30.
Oh,
Leilani.
Oh,
yes.
Leilani. Okay.
Yeah.
And Keston, you have yours. Desiree, did you actually get the book as well? Yes, you got it? Okay, fantastic. So you guys can read the book, and Kutisa, you can actually go through the PowerPoints and some of the other information here as well. That'll help a great deal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, guys, we'll let you go, and then I'll see you again tomorrow. But there is a quiz tomorrow as well.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
Good afternoon, guys.
Yep, take care.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Ciao.